commitment to double adaptation financing. And so at this COP, we need to double down on delivery. We need accountability. We need to make good on the promises that we made, so that there is trust in the process, within the process, outside the process. So I guess that's just my quick view on, where we are, where we need to go. But I also wanted to talk a bit about why I have that perspective as somebody who comes from the Marshall Islands as a small island developing state, where climate change represents for us, as it does for all the islands of the Pacific who have made this as a declaration from our leaders and identified climate change as the greatest security threat in our region. And my country is an atoll island country. I'm not sure how many of you have been to an atoll. It is not a high island, a volcanic island that you might think of in tourist postcards from Hawaii. It is a small island, 2 meters above sea level, where you can see the ocean almost on both sides of the land and any place that you are. So very narrow islets that I like to say, when you go into the Marshall Islands on an airplane and you're going into the airport, you think you are going to land in the ocean. That's about how the runway is wide enough for one plane and one small road along the side. So that's my context. So sea level rise clearly is front and center as a oncoming disaster, but also a threat that we live with already, particularly when we have king tides that are already flooding, even when there's not a storm. I have to tell you, it's just that the tide is high. We don't have to have high winds to have flooding. We have changes in rainfall patterns that mean more frequent droughts and a longer dry season. We have increased temperatures and increased water scarcity, and all of these things mean a cascading effects. So for example, with longer droughts and water scarcity, you now have a lot of health-related impacts for people who do not have access to water. So there's sort of cascading effects of climate change that we're dealing with in the Marshall Islands. Going back to sea level rise, I will tell you that in Madro, which is the atoll that I grew up on, sea level has risen by approximately 0.3 inches per year since '93, which is triple the global average. So the sea in our part of the world is rising at a faster rate than in other parts of the world. And 0.3 inches might not seem much to you, but I can tell you, as somebody who lives in a place that is 2 meters above sea level, where our aquifers, we're essentially living on coral, every millionth and tenth of an inch matters and affects our ability to grow crops. When I was growing up, you could use well water to cook with. You can no longer do that. Well water today is now used for toilets and for plumbing. So, I mean, it's an enormous difference in terms of how you live your life. We now depend essentially on captured rainwater is our only source of water. We know that from a report from the World Bank that in order to make our coastlines more resilient to climate change, we will be needing to spend approximately, 13 to 42 million per year in the 2020s, and that goes up to 16 to 58 million per year in the 2040s. that would be as much as 13% of our GDP. So we have been given, we have worked with the World Bank, we've worked with engineers to see what it would take to make our coastlines more resilient, but on top of that, actually build up the land to have higher ground. We're talking about human mobility and people moving to higher ground. In my country, there isn't higher ground. If we're going to have higher ground, we're going to need to build it. And we've been told that that will cost in the tens of billions for us to do. So there's no pathway that I see at this moment to how we can have the resources that we need to ensure that my children and their children have a place to live. And that's the reality. And so that's why we're here, and that's why we come to these COPs, so that people do understand that reality, but also understand that we expect the world to work with us to ensure that, in fact, the Marshall Islands remains a country and a nation and a community and a people with its culture and its heritage and its language and its beauty, and part of the global community. That is my expectation, not just from this COP, but from this process as a whole. That means meeting the commitments on finance, and I think we've heard about those. You know, the 100 billion is a starting point. We're going to have to look at much larger amounts and find ways to actually finance those amounts. I think we need to see much more on the delivery of the commitment to double adaptation financing. That was a start, a good start, but we need to see credibly how it's going to be delivered. We need to have that conversation here on accounting for that commitment. And until those things happen, it's very difficult to have trust that the process can respond to the crisis, the reality of the crisis. I say that on finance, but we're seeing the same, as I had mentioned before, accountability on the emissions reductions. You know, 1.5 to stay alive is a mantra that came out of the islands. And I don't know if all that remember that, you know, pre-Paris 1.5 was seen as some radical notion that islands were championing. And yet now we've seen with each IPCC report that 1.5 is really the lifeline for everyone on this planet, and that beyond 1.5, truly catastrophic climate impacts will be hitting everyone. And the reality is that as those impacts hit, there are those who will have more ability to respond and those who will have less. There are some who are on the front lines and others who are already protected or have the means to protect themselves. And if we want to have a world in which I want at least my children to live in, then we need to be protecting those on the front lines. In doing so, you'll protect everyone else. I think with that, I'll end and look forward to hearing the remarks from others. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tina, and many thanks for reminding us how real some of the lofty challenges that we talk about are. For you, it's easy to talk about sea level rise. It's difficult to live with it. So many thanks. You also mentioned a really important word, namely trust. trust of the next generation in our ability to tackle these challenges. And I'm going to turn to you in a second as our youth representative on migration and climate change. But I've seen that my countryman from the European Commission has just joined us. And before you drop offline again, Mr. Köhler, would love to have you give us your views. You are the Acting Director General of the European Commission's Directorate General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, a long title. DG ECHO is the short version of it. You're responsible for providing humanitarian emergency and disaster response on behalf of the EU. Mr. Köhler, previous speakers, including Mr. Vitorino from the IOM, have talked about the loss and damage associated with climate change, including displacement, obviously. Can you tell us a little more about how this impacts your humanitarian, your daily work, and how the EU is addressing this challenge? And many thanks for joining us from Brussels today.
Thank you very much, Benedict. I hope you can hear me. Is that the case? Right, great.
Loud
we had
and
some
clear.
technical glitches, unfortunately, so I apologize for being late and apologize for having missed part of the debate. But I found it really, really good that the organizers and partners of this event bring in also humanitarian dimension. At first sight, climate and humanitarian seem to be two different cups of tea. But this is really wrong, and when you are a humanitarian practitioner, you see it every day, because what climate change does is, on the one hand, it generates, it produces new humanitarian crises. If you just think of the floods in Pakistan that we have now all been impressed with, where 33 million people were affected, you don't really need to make the point any longer. I mean, it is very obvious, but you also have the droughts in the whole of Africa. You have floods in Sudan. You have the wildfires now in Europe, for example, every year. From the ECHO perspective, we had to open an office in South Africa last year, simply because there are so many new climate change generated disasters in countries such as Mozambique, such as Zimbabwe, that we had to basically gear up to it. So there are new disasters. At the same time, climate change makes existing problems, existing conflicts, existing disasters even worse. Think of Yemen, which is one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world. It is a crisis that is man-made. There's war, there is a conflict, but at the same time, there are recurrent floods. There are also droughts. There's a water shortage in the country. And this, of course, comes and is exacerbated by climate change, so it makes things even worse. Therefore, the distinction between the climate crisis and the humanitarian crisis in the world becomes more and more artificial. In reality, climate concerns nature, but it concerns human beings, obviously, and that means that we have to deal with the consequences. And the first consequence that we see more and more on every continent, basically, is the massive displacement, forced displacement of people. People have to flee because they're fleeing from disasters, they're fleeing from the effects of climate change, they're fleeing from resource conflicts that are made worse by climate change. So I think we have to think both things together, and that is what we try to do at DG ECHO. We need to have a very strong focus on the consequences of climate change on human beings. And, you know, their displacement is obviously one of the major issues. Most of our humanitarian budget, and we are the second biggest humanitarian donor in the world, is in fact focused on displaced people, on refugees, but also internally displaced people, of which we have more than 200 million in the world right now. And therefore, displacement as a consequence of disaster and as a consequence of adverse effects of climate change has become a huge priority for us. We need to understand that this does not only concern individuals. This is bad enough. Individuals that need to flee, that need protection, that need basic social services, and of course a durable solution for their life, but it impacts also on societies and economies. I just mentioned Pakistan, 33 million people that are suffering from the floods, but also massive damage because floods mean that the harvest is gone, that you don't have a seed for the next agricultural season, that some of the cash crops that you're producing, like cotton in the case of Pakistan, are gone, and that has a huge impact on the entire value chain. I've read studies that say that 10% of the GDP of Pakistan depends on cotton, and this is now affected. So it's individuals, it's families, but also economies, societies, including community life, cultural life, and the resilience of communities that are really being affected by climate change. And therefore, we need to do much more to help. We need to do more than just help to respond to crisis situations, but we need to invest in the resilience and the preparedness. And therefore, for us, the self-reliance of people at risk and the self-reliance then also of displaced populations has become a major issue for our work. This means that we have to look, of course, at their immediate needs, food, shelter, protection, safe water, but we also need to look into education needs, into healthcare, housing, land, life supports, basic services, and their preparedness to address crisis. Now, this is something which becomes ever more important in our funding streams. 35% of humanitarian aid today is used for cash transfers to people who are forcibly displaced, and as once again, very often because of climate events. But we have to go beyond humanitarian aid. On the humanitarian aid, we have specific budget lines for disaster preparedness, and we have, of course, a very strong incentive to work together with other financing sources, such as development donors, in a nexus spirit. And there we come into really big amounts of money. We come to projects on the migration, on the management and governance of migration and forced displacement. We come to apply climate adaptation projects that prepare communities better for the effects of floods, for example, or droughts. And we need to think the use of these funds together. And therefore, it's not only a matter of being aware of this, it's not only a matter of linking up with development actors and putting the money on the table. It's also about creating the right coordination mechanisms. That is one of the reasons why the EU has taken over the chair of the platform on disaster displacement, together with our colleagues from Kenya. We need to have a body that thinks climate and the effects of climate on human beings and societies, humanitarian issues and development issues together. We have taken over the chair of the Platform for Disaster and Displacement for 1.5 years in order to strengthen global coordination and action on all these issues. And we want to come to very concrete coordinated action in the field of research and data collection and analysis, obviously, because we simply do not know enough at this moment in time to support capacity and development initiatives that need to be supported in this area. We also need to have a better linkage between humanitarian development efforts, because once again, in a country like Sudan that has floods every year, for example, that has a major humanitarian caseload, we can only make a change if we anticipate. If we do not only respond to the flood that comes every year, but if we help communities to prepare for them, perhaps to resettle, but also to prepare another politics of settlement, of urbanism, urbanization, of village development in order to be prepared and not lose their property every year, including also their agricultural source of income. And obviously, such a platform is also useful as a source of advocacy and dialogue. We have to bring this debate to the international community. And all this needs to be based on sound analysis, and therefore, in the European Union, we adopted the document last summer, so only a couple of months ago, a so-called staff working document that in a way enshrines our philosophy on the issue of disaster and climate-related displacement. We have to think these things together, and I can assure you that for us this is going to stay a priority. So it's not only because of COP27, but it's because of the sheer needs and the sheer trends that we see when it comes to the needs of persons that are among the most vulnerable ones in Africa, Asia, and Latin America in particular, but also increasingly on the European continent. We have to act urgently, we have to act together, and we have to break out of our silos, the humanitarian, the climate, the development silos, in order to come to joined up solutions if we don't want to lose more time and if we don't want to see more human suffering. Thank you very much, Benedict.
Thank you so much, Michael. I hope you're staying with us for the Q&A session after this, so thank you so much. Let me now turn to you, Rose. And having heard all this, what are your views? How much trust do you have in the system? How much faith do you have in the ability of the UN system and the civil society to deliver? And what is your generation contributing? And what can we expect from you as much as what can you expect from us?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. The youth in the audience? Oh, okay. Still lacking, but hopefully we'll get there. Thanks for coming through. I'm not sure if I can represent you enough because you have your own voices, but I'll try, according to my experience and knowledge, to share some of the voices, the youth voices, especially from the African continent. So my name is Rose Kobsinge, and I'm a Ugandan climate activist, but I also initiated and lead the Yango Migration Working Group, which is, Yango is the official constituency of children and youth, the UNFCCC. So talking about, human mobility and climate change and everyone has talked about the details about climate change, how it affects, mobility, the floods, the droughts, the heat waves. But I was just reflecting and remembering when we were in primary school, for those ones who can relate, please let me know, we used to debate about water and food, which one is better. The motion would be, water is better than food. And then you have to either oppose or propose. Until recently, that's when I realized, actually this motion the aim was to bring to their attention that actually water and food are the most important, because but looking at how climate change is coming through, it's either water or food. And for us, Africa, if anything touches our water and anything touches our food, especially given that our communities depend heavily on agriculture, then that is something that is erasing us. That is something that we need to fight with solidarity and unity. So for the youth, I should say that, I don't know if you feel the same, but I feel low energy from COP27. I don't know what is happening, but there's low energy, the youth are quite disappointed that it's the usual talks, but we're really hopeful at the same time that these talks are going to result into actual implementation, especially in protecting the vulnerable, poor women and children and the disabled people in communities at risk. Coming from Uganda, we're able to, with the support from IOM, and of course the government of Uganda, we're able to contribute as youth from the Eastern Horn of Africa to contribute to the Kampala Declaration. And luckily enough, we had 3 of our points represented in the declaration, so we thought that was a very great step. And of course for us, our side is implementation. If our voices are represented in this declaration, when does implementation happen? So my minister has already left, but I had good questions for her, especially on following up after signing the declaration. So what happens after that? And I'm sure I'll reach out to her and we'll figure out how to continue engaging youth transformatively without tokenism. And so back to the trust in the UN system. That is a very tricky question. But first of all, I'd like to recognize that as the young people, even though we have our own demands, sometimes are very proactive on our side, even though other people frame them as noise or something. We feel that we recognize the support that is coming through. It's slow, but we need to appreciate that it's coming, but we need it to move faster. More young people, especially those ones at the front line, more young people living in flood-prone areas, in Somalia, in famine-affected areas, in Karamoja. So I'll share an example. We struggle, most of us from the African continent struggle to find budgets to come to COP. And not only budgets, when it came to finance, it became even more complicated. So for me, if it wasn't for IOM and UNICEF and the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, I wouldn't have been here. But for the support, that's why I'm here. But even though we recognize that there's progress, we need to keep pushing, but we need to see the UN system open up to the young people. It is very hard to access the finance because of the systems that are in place for the UN. We understand they are there for efficiency and transparency, but it's very hard for us to access the grants, the small grants, the GF funds, because you work with the government. And with our governments, not that we don't have, I don't think we have enough trust in them, but we try. But we need to see that finance, we need to see the UN open up the system, open up the hands to ensure that the money, actually the climate finance or any finance that is got from philanthropists or development banks or financial institutions trickles down to the youth, especially those ones living in vulnerable communities. And we want to sit with you on the same table and figure out how can we make climate finance or any finance that comes through to support resilience building, how can we make it work for youth, especially, sometimes you're applying for grants and they ask you for 10 years of experience in operation, you're like, how old was I 10 years ago? Like, it's not, you're literally excluded from the word go. So that is the comment I have on the UN system. And we'd love to keep engaging with you. We want to collaborate with governments, with the UN, with civil society. As the youth, we're not there to fight, we're not there to quarrel, but we want to figure out solutions that work for our communities. For example, I would like to invite you all tomorrow at the Climate Mobility Pavilion. We'll be presenting the African Youth Declaration on Climate Mobility. That declaration, just a snapshot, is that we recognize that there's a humanitarian crisis, but the solutions that are coming through and the empty commitments, for example, the 100 billion, the fights on trying to pull out the loss and damage from the agenda, all those ones, they're not in line with the humanitarian crisis we're recognizing, especially for us young people from Africa. Many of our young people are perishing in the Mediterranean Sea. Many young people are dying even before they reach the Mediterranean Sea, in the desert, the heating, the deserts, the hunger. And we're here talking about food security, which is a very big part of why people move. For example, in Uganda, in Karamoja sub-region, we have a few Ugandan youth in the room. We've been having, I know they don't want to call it thing, but we've been having food insecurity. And over 900 people died this year. And that is what I could quote. I think more died, but they have not been tracking properly. So it goes back again to the data and research, that research gap on climate mobility. And but we have so many kids and women, young girls especially, on the streets of Kampala, and most of them come from that region. Because of the droughts that are increasing, the prolonged droughts in that region, and the food insecurity, those are the major drivers for these kids coming on the streets. For you who have been in Kampala, if you've seen the streets and the kids, most of them are from that region. So, and then we recently made so much noise when we recognized what was happening in Karamoja. There was some relief that went there, but why do we wait for people to make noise, for the development actors and the government to act and to address, for example, hunger? It's unacceptable. Countries are going to the space. There's big innovations when our people are still starving. Over 280 million people in Africa are still suffering from chronic hunger. That detail is given by, I think it's WeWeb. It's unacceptable, and it makes me feel emotional. How can a child who is just born go to bed hungry? Like, I have no idea what they would be thinking in their head, like, I was born to die or to suffer. It just makes me feel angry. But I still know that we can do it. We can do it from the UN, being the United Nations, coming with solidarity and bringing the private sector on. But most importantly, the prediction and preparedness and early warning systems. With the floods, over 600 people have died in Nigeria. Over 600 lives. And these are lives. It's not like you're counting money, £600 or $600. These are human lives. These are children. this is a whole, I can't even, I need to stop because I'm going to be emotional in that part. But I think the way we are treating the climate emergency, we're not treating it as an emergency, especially from the world leaders. Why do you make commitments and promises and then don't act on them? Maybe we need to have that intergenerational conversation to understand why you make promises that you cannot deliver. Is there something that we, the youth, maybe are doing wrong? Because we're starting to feel guilty that we continue showing these people that we want to work with, we want to figure out solutions for the challenges that our communities are facing, but nothing is coming through. So what is it that we can do? What is it that we're doing wrong? And so that we figure out solutions together. So with the African Youth Declaration on Climate Change, we have our demands, we have our commitments. We're committed, just a snapshot, I don't want to give out everything. Come tomorrow at 4:30 at the Climate Mobility Pavilion, but we're committed to continue raising awareness about climate change because there's finance coming through for adaptation and building resilience to the villages and rural communities and urban communities, but the literacy level about climate change is very low. I always share this story that in my undergraduate I worked on climate awareness and and the effect of climate change on food security in the western part of the country in Kamwenge. And I found like 90% of the people I interviewed, there were about 160 people, 90% of the people interviewed didn't know about climate change. And for those ones, and all of them 100% acknowledge that things are getting worse. There's one person I talked to, for example, who gave a very detailed experience that they only drink porridge for lunch and serve dinner serve food for dinner because there's not enough food. And had to give out some of her children. Her husband works in the city because the crops failed. So the husband had to move and go and work somewhere. So she's now like heading the family alone, and it's very complicated. And she literally broke into tears when she was trying to explain to me. And then the literacy level, back to the literacy levels, is that whereas everyone acknowledged that they're facing more droughts than years back, we had the fall armyworm infestation, we had the locust infestation a few years back, but no one knows. Someone told me that because of the solar panels, many people are using solar home systems and they're attracting more sun, hence causing droughts in their area. Some of them think it's the will of God. God is punishing them for their sins. So we need to go back as young people. This one is your challenge. I don't think we are going to wait for the curriculum to change. We need to now push and ensure climate literacy using formal and informal means reaches everyone, especially the vulnerable people. In the meantime, we also continue demanding for our national curriculum from elementary school to tertiary to include climate education. And so we are doing that. As young people, we are pushing through that. For example, I lead the Climate and Biodiversity Initiative Uganda, and we are working with primary schools in slum areas who face droughts, and we are also working with communities in Kasese to address loss and damage, which is a key thing that we need to push to see COP27, COP28 cover up, and we need that loss and damage facility coming through urgently because we're in an emergency. So I think I'll just also want to emphasize that we want to work with the UN, with our governments, with all stakeholders as collaborators. We want to co-design solutions together. We don't really want to be left behind. That's what I would say. And engaging us in a transformative way, not just allowing people, just getting youth to come here and then they don't. I'm talking to everyone who is online and listening. So for our governments, for example, build the capacity of youth to be negotiators, because those decisions that are being made, those policies that are going to come out, who is going to implement them if the capacity of young people is not built? It's the young people that are going to implement them. But then we won't know how those policies came in place. Our voices, because the dynamics have changed, the future has changed. the future we admire right now is not the future that our leaders admired 30 years ago. Things have completely changed. We are more focused on a green, sustainable, equal future. We're more focused on a rights-based and gender-sensitive and child-sensitive future. So thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Many, many thanks. You mentioned low energy. You're certainly high energy. It's great to have you with us. And we will have a couple of questions, I'm sure, in your direction. Let me turn to one more high energy person, and Andrew Harper, a special advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is a friend and hopefully will not hold it against me that I've kept you to last. If you stick to 5 minutes, then we're perfectly on time and we have some time for Q&A. Over to you. And I think you've just come back from Mozambique and might want to share a couple of impressions with us on that.
Okay, thanks, Benedict, and I won't comment on how good a German officer you were. I think we'll just move the talking points away and focus on what's key. And I think what's key is the collaboration. I don't think we need to be sort of talking too much more about the fact that loss and damage needs to be on the agenda. It's now on the agenda. We don't need to be talking about the human dimension, because I think by having these events, it's already very much here and now. I don't think we need to be talking about the importance of including the community and the youth and the gender in, because it should be a given. But it's still not. And so even yesterday when I walked around some of the panels, you'd still have manels. It was just like, it was incredible. You'd still have panels involving all Northern Europeans. So I think the passion and the calling people out about where is the youth, where is the gender, where is the local consultations, still needs to be done, unfortunately. So, so congratulations to IOM and to everyone who's been involved in bringing people together, but we still have to continue on that. Yes, so it's 2:28, I'll do my 5 minutes. I did come back from Mozambique, arrived yesterday, and I thought Mozambique was a great example about what is going right and what is going wrong. What's going right is that you've got a state that's being impacted by the most extreme climate impacts, weather impacts, cyclone after cyclone after storm. And if they're not being hit by a cyclone or a storm, they're being hit by droughts. And that may or may not, it depends on the level of attribution you wish to put to poor governance or inequality or lack of investment in education or lack of investment in use of resources. But you're talking with a country that's got almost 1 million displaced persons. Combination of conflict, combination of people being displaced by cyclones and drought. 1 million people. Despite that, you've got a country that is doing what it can to locally integrate those people who have been displaced. Unfortunately, adaptation is not going to work for everyone. What Tina was saying in terms of the Marshall Islands, like there are countries, there are territories which are going to be adaptation where they are now is just not going to work. We've got to be realistic about that. And so the issue of loss and damage, we've got to move beyond that and sort of say, what are the mechanisms now? And it's not good enough just to keep it at the national level. And this is where I sort of say what was good from Mozambique, but it's also throughout Africa. The community consultations, the community committees. And in Mozambique, surprise, surprise, they've included refugees and IDPs in their disaster risk reduction committees. They've got, out of the 150 districts in Mozambique, they've got 134 adaptation plans, district adaptation plans. So this means involving communities at the local level to come up and sort of say, what do they need to adapt? So we don't have excuses. It may not be perfect, but for God's sake, they're doing much better than most other countries. Out of those 134, there's been 34 districts that have received support for climate financing. So why is that? Is it Mozambique's fault? Maybe, because when I was talking to the CEO of Pegasus, he was saying one of the challenges of getting financing to A country or B country depends on the country. In case of Mozambique, it's the currency. Okay, let's try and figure out how we sort of mitigate that risk. But don't tell me there's reasons why you can't invest in countries that are doing the right thing. Because these countries, generally the ones who are hosting refugees, are the ones who are really at the stick in terms of climate action. Sorry, at the stick in terms of the climate emergency. And we continue to take them for granted. So DRC, problems in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, you've got tens of thousands of people coming across into Malawi. If we don't do support more in terms of providing that basic, it's not even a sort of a sense of fairness, it's an issue of moral, the right thing to do morally. We've got countries after countries, whether it be in South Asia or the Middle East or in Africa, who are providing protection and assistance to both refugees and internally displaced persons, but they need help. So, moving on, suggestions. I won't even go too much more in terms of what are the barriers for climate financing, because there's been some really good papers being put out recently, including ICRC's work with ODI, but there's been others. PDD's also been doing some great work. IOM's been, like, everyone's understanding what the challenges are, but we now need to move to that next point of basically stopping the excuses. And the only way we can do that is to sort of ensure that the populations on the front lines, not necessarily the national governments, the communities, the districts, the provinces have, I don't like using this term so much, but bankable, investable products which cover the whole spectrum of adaptation. Because it's easy enough to be sort of saying, we need to invest in adaptation. But then you sort of go down and say, okay, what about the schools? What about the livelihoods? What about the renewables? What about the changing, the need for agroforestry? What about the health systems? What about accountability? But also, what about the issue of good governance? And that's, we can't ignore that. There's a problem in governments in a lot of these areas, governance in a lot of these areas. Money which may be being provided at the national level may not be getting down to the communities. So let's work in the communities and make sure that those plans fit in with the national adaptation plans. I'll just leave it at that, but key point, invest in peaceful coexistence before we lose that opportunity to do something, before we lose that peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. You're definitely a better German officer than I am, just on time. Before we go into Q&A, and we have 15 minutes left, could I ask you, Madame Dumas, maybe to join us on stage in case there are any questions? Madame Dumas is the climate envoy of IOM, so if there are any migration-specific questions, she is the person to deal with them. Before we go into questions, can I just ask you to keep 3 things in mind? If you have a question, get up, identify yourself, address the question to a specific panelist, and keep it brief. 12 minutes left, let's do this. Any questions in the room? Over there, please. And I think there might be a mic around. It's on its way back there. Yeah. And remember, no low energy questions. Let's prove her wrong.
Hi everyone, Arwas Hab from Egypt. My specialty is on refugees, migration, and GBV field. So my question is actually addressing 2 things. The just transition, because we had a lot of representation from African countries, frontliners who are actually affected directly from the climate change. And then we bring on the just transition. So we didn't actually tackle on the panel the finance of the just transition. We actually mentioned only what is happening, what is the obligation that is on the stake line, but we never state the obligations of the countries that actually caused the climate change. We also emphasize on the localities action and the effort that they're doing, but we didn't emphasize on how to actually mandate the obligations of the developed countries that actually cause the climate change. So this is the first question. The second question is actually on the changing of the perspective, because it's highly centralized on the European westernized approach. So how can we decentralize the approach from the global north to the global south? Because again, on the just transition issue, it's not only on generational justice, it's also about the regional justice, the geographical justice. So economically wise, the region that is emphasizing the more climate change and actually that not abiding by the obligation that they are stating are the global north kind of perspective. So when we're talking about financing, we have to take in consideration as well the obligations on the global south. So this is my two questions, and the questions are based on status that we have to have in mind on obligation-wise, because at COP we are not addressing like talks, because these talks I'm sure that we had a lot of them. So we need answers. Thank you.
Perfect. And before the answers are coming, I have made a mistake. I forgot one more special advisor on climate from the Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries and Small Island Developing States. Welcome on stage, sir. And I think this question is almost made for you, if you would like to take a first step.
Hello. Yep. So I'll address this question of just transition very, very briefly with the example of the least developed countries. So clearly, for the least developed countries, one of the important priority areas and targets is high rates of growth. This has been both in the Istanbul Programme of Action for the LDCs and now the recently adopted Doha Programme of Action. So clearly there's a need to decouple energy emissions from growth, because the LDCs need high rates of growth in order to exit the category, in order to finance health, education, and move up the, and so in just one point about this with regard to just transition is there are, I think, 7 least developed, recently graduated or graduation pipeline LDCs that are dependent on fossil fuel exports in some measure or the other. And in some cases, the revenues and the proceeds from fossil fuel exports have more or less fueled, shall I say, excuse the pun, their growth and led and contributed significantly to their, the progress that they have made towards graduation. So the challenge of decarbonization, and also this challenge of what we call smooth transition, because when the LDCs exit the category, they lose the LDC preferences, whether these are trade preferences, intellectual property preferences, financing, ODA, and so on. So they're facing a double challenge, both the challenge of graduating out of the LDC category and the challenge of the transition to a low carbon economy. So these countries, I think, need specific attention from the United Nations system, from others, from the development partners, in order to make this transition. And I think the example at COP26 of South Africa is perhaps something which could be replicated and extended, but indeed, in order to move, both the least developed country group and the SIDS have made commitments on, zero net emissions, but they do need assistance to make this transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, Madame Dumas, you've got something to add to this?
Thank you. If I may, just to complement what our colleague just said, on the question of decentralization of the discussions, and if no one from UNFCCC is in the room, I would like just to answer that this is mostly addressed, if I can say, in the negotiations. Negotiations are done on the basis of equality. So all countries, of course, of the world who want to participate in the convention negotiations are participating in the process. And of course, countries of the South in different groups, either regional groups or more political groups like the CVF all the LDCs are represented and participating, and the voice of the South is mostly, of course, heard in the loss and damage subtrack up to now, because it was in the adaptation pillar and moving on a more separate way since the adoption 2 days ago of that new agenda with the loss and damage finance in the negotiation. So of course, I mean, every country, I mean, it's a discussion of parties, so every country has, of course, to move on, I mean, inside the process of negotiations and the discussions, you know, beyond the advocacy that we can do outside the rooms like we are doing now. I mean, really all the important subjects you mentioned, like just transition, which is referring to the common but differentiated responsibilities, and the promises which were done, I mean, in terms of climate finance, the global 100 billion. I'm not talking of the specific adaptation or loss and damage, but the global 100. I mean, all this is being tackled, of course, in the groups of discussion, either in the pillar of the finance negotiation, or inside the pillar of adaptation on loss and damage, the VIM mechanism. So, of course, the voice of the youth in each country have to be heard by their own representatives, by their delegations, by the official delegations. And if I may give an advice, I mean, the best thing for different delegations is to include someone from the young, you know, Yungo, or anyway the young constituency in their delegations. It does happen. A certain number of countries do have a young person inside their delegation. So of course it is one way of being sure that then you are part of these discussions and you achieve your goal maybe as you would like to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madame Limar. We have time for one brief question over there, and let's try to end on time. Microphone is on its way. Remember the high energy.
Yes, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. My name is Hassan Yassin from Somalia, which currently is facing more difficult under the climate change issues. As I'm speaking now, more than 600,000 livestock have passed away. Over 1 million people are displaced, and 4 million people are under starvation. My question will go to Carol, Director of the IOM, because sometimes as we advocate as a pathway of migration to an option to adaptation, yet we are saying that we are seeing people, when they migrate, they are living worse lives than they used to live in IDBs. Because in those IDBs, when it floods, people yet are complaining they cannot survive it. When it is too heat stress, there are also the always problem with the climate change has caused. So my question, as a UN mechanism or an IOM power, what can better be changed in preparation of better livelihoods even while people get migrated? My second question is, youth are the forefront lines who mostly address climate change issues, yet they are the least who get the access of climate finance in addressing climate change issues. What better can we change so that youth organizations and youth-led organizations can access that climate finance and not only big organizations?
Thank you so much for those two questions. I obviously should have added a fourth rule, one question only, but two very important questions. Let's turn it back to the panel. 1 minute, please, in your answers.
Thank you. Nice to see you here. We met several times already. You know, yes, of course, the situation is extremely tense and terrible in Somalia and several countries of the east of Africa, other places for that. How to have populations better prepared before avoiding rather the move. Again, this comes back, and we can talk about it more in precision. It comes back to the adaptation programs, projects, preparedness projects, disaster risk reduction. As in terms of IOM, we do have really a lot of these kinds of projects at the level of the communities to try to help them not leave their lands, because they are attached to their land. There is an emotional, of course, affective attachment to the land. We try to help people to protect themselves from floods or from, well, the drought or from other. In South Sudan, for instance, we have a very good early warning flood system which allows populations to know in time, and as well another, system to try, project to try to fix them and to help them stay where they want. So we have programs for that, and we try to develop them with you, with the communities, with the local authorities, and with the governments. So we can go in detail on that. Secondly, how to include better use in the finance discussions. Again, yes, but the excess of finance, I couldn't hear. Again, use in discussion is through your national, mostly your national representation, or through Youth Yango. And from this, I leave the floor to Rose.
I think we're running out of time. Maybe I could just
30 seconds.
Yes, I could add that I think our request to the UN agencies and of course our governments and everyone would like to see the UN be our advocates, because sometimes it's very hard for us to reach out to our governments for some reasons, because of the way our culture is set up. Our culture is like young people are supposed to listen to the elders. So we need some pressure from the top, where the UN recommends, like, we want to see this number of people come to the negotiations or to other decision-making tables. And for access to finance, the request we made, would like to have a finance, an African Youth Climate Mobility Finance. And that request goes to everyone in here, working with the UN, working with development banks and other financial institutions. And with access, would like the UN to come and review the system with us, and making that finance not only go through the government. Our governments need the finance, but it takes long, it's bureaucratic to reach the local communities, to reach the youth, to reach the people that need it the most. So I'd like you to open your hearts and your hands and everything about the UN system to allow more access to finance for the youth and the women and people in the local communities. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rose. Unfortunately, we've now run out of time. The next group is already waiting out there. I'm sure we could go on for hours and hours. Many thanks for your attention. Many thanks to all the partners for putting this together. Have a good and productive time here in Sharm. Make good use of it. Make it count. Make it high energy.